It's a crying shame when movies get released before their time. It sometimes means that for years a masterpiece gets nothing but hate when what it really deserves is an audience that understands it. Luckily, enough time has passed that these movies are now getting the love that they deserve. So I'm Amy from What Culture, and here are 10 hated horror movies that are awesome now. 10. The Thing. We'll get this one out of the way first because by virtue of how shocking it is, it has been talked to death. Now pretty widely agreed to be one of the very best horror films of all time, The Thing, at its time of release, was a laughingstock. Horror magazine Cinefantastique even went as far as to publish a cover asking if The Thing was the most hated horror film of all time, if you can believe that. Ever since, people have been trying to figure out why the film was so hated at the time. Many film historians credit it to the movie's nihilistic, depressing tone, which people vehemently rejected whilst they were in the midst of a depression. It sounds about right, to be fair, given that the film's ending is about as bleak as it gets, just two blokes waiting to freeze to death in the great frozen expanse. It's the film's cynicism, suspicion, and general dark mood that make it so great though, amongst other things of course. And it's just a shame that it was released at the exact time when audiences didn't want to see exactly that. 9. Halloween 3: Season of the Witch. It's no secret that people were majorly disappointed with Halloween's third installment. Not only did it deviate majorly in plot from what they expected, but it failed to feature the franchise's famous villain at all. Despite the obvious problems with it, there is actually plenty to like about Halloween 3. One thing being that it's the last of the series that John Carpenter was actually directly involved in making. It has an interesting plot, a sort of thriller spin, and were it not for the fact that it was sold as a Halloween sequel, I think it actually could have done really well. There's androids, weird supernatural medallions, and all manner of engaging kills. Its fatal flaw is that it doesn't have Michael Myers, and that's what made everyone hate it at the time. Now that we know what to expect, we can appreciate it for what it is rather than hating it for what it's not. And what it is a pretty good horror that's a fun ride if you don't take it too seriously. 8. Shivers. The least sexy, sex-crazed movie you've ever seen, Shivers follows the exploits of a bunch of people suffering from a parasite infection that causes them to become both enraged and aroused. Given its shocking content, we're talking sexual assault, graphic violence, and really grim parasite-y stuff, it's not exactly a surprise that audiences at the time of its release were, shocked. It didn't receive good reviews, and that was mainly due to the sexual content, leading most critics to deem the film indecent. Like many other films on this list and of this time, the controversial elements of the movie were used to drum up a moral panic, and so any merit or enjoyment was buried under outrage. Years later, we can separate our worries about decency from our experience of the film, and it allows for audiences to appreciate the latter for what it is. Now, this film isn't for everyone. I'm not even sure it's for me, and that's because it's full of things that you might not even want to see in a horror context, for example, the sexual assault. But for lots of people, it's the shock value of the film that makes it a great horror. It's an attack on the mind, the senses, and the inescapable indecency of it is today what many people think makes it so awesome. 7. The Burning. It was an unfortunate side effect of releasing slashers in the early 80s that anything post-Friday the 13th would just be accused of ripping off Friday the 13th, and The Burning fell victim to this exact paradigm. Falling into that fantastic niche that is summer camp-based slashers, The Burning is now regarded as a very solid addition to the genre, capitalizing on all the well-known slasher tropes as well as the legend of Cropsey. It's a film that delivers exactly what you think it's going to. We're talking camp counselors romping in the woods and meeting their bloody ends, scary stories around the campfire, the whole lot. In terms of its similarity to Friday the 13th, I can understand why it received so much hate for copying the film, seeing as it did come out just 1 year later and shares some blatant similarities. We now know, however, that the idea was created and documented long enough before Friday the 13th to confirm that it wasn't plagiarized. Since we're now past the hating it because it's similar stage, we're able to appreciate the film for the schlocky slasher mess that it is. 6. Prometheus. This one might be a little controversial, but I genuinely don't think that Prometheus was the cinematic mistake everyone made it out to be. Financially, it did pretty well, and the critics didn't hate it too much, but the public opinion was another story. Alien franchise fans made it very clear that Prometheus was, in their eyes, Alien's younger, uglier, less talented sibling. No film is ever going to beat Alien at its own game, so I think in retrospect we were all setting ourselves up for failure by expecting that. When you take it in relative isolation, Prometheus is a pretty solid movie that plenty of people, whether they admitted it or not, genuinely enjoyed. Now with all the outrage of the time firmly left in the past, we can appreciate the film had plenty of merits, from its strong performances through to its visual intrigue. And be real with yourself, it is a nice looking film. I think it's time to admit that Prometheus deserves its renewed recognition as a great sci-fi horror. 5. Children of the Corn, 1984. Another cult classic, this Stephen King adaptation was initially met with lukewarm reviews at best. People called it boring, stupid. One Rotten Tomatoes reviewer even called it a kiddie thriller that runs in circles. Now, I don't think any Stephen King material is particularly kiddie-friendly, never mind a film in which a bunch of children overrun their town and murder everyone. So the film, I will admit, was victim to the limitations of budgetary constraints. Had there been more money, there could have been more gore, more ridiculous monster effects and such. For what it is though, it's nowhere near a terrible film. It's really quotable, easy to follow, and runs on a premise that's engaging and scary, because we all know that murderous kids are classically scary. For the most part, Stephen King's adaptations have only gotten better with age, as we all go easier on the filmmakers of the time. They didn't have millions of dollars to pour into CGI and big stars most of the time, and considering that we still got classics like It, Children of the Corn, and Carrie, we should really be thankful. 4. Triangle. This 2009 British offering follows protagonist Jess as she embarks on the boat trip of a lifetime. Part of Triangle's gimmick is that it's very confusing at first, but then slowly unfurls itself as each twist gives way to more understanding of what came before. As with many films that hinge their appeal on a gimmick, Triangle was at first met with a mixed response. People in general praised Melissa George for her performance as our leading lady, but with the caveat that even her strong display couldn't make up for the film's shortcomings. Many critics and audiences alike lamented that the film just wasn't scary. It was instead confusing and repetitive, a criticism that I think actually boils down to saying, I didn't understand it straight away, and now I'm angry. Since its release, it's managed to gain a fair bit of praise, with more viewers commenting on its clever direction and surprisingly poignant emotional turns. It's now generally regarded as a pretty solid horror, carried steadily on its twists, turns, and thriller elements. Plus, it does have one of the Hemsworths in it, and that's always a selling point for someone. 3. Event Horizon. Being as well known as it is now, it's hard to believe that at one point Event Horizon was panned. It was a box office failure, and critics rushed to complain about how uninspired, disappointing, and generally terrible it was. In the years since, though, it's become a confident cult classic, with Lawrence Fishburne and Sam Neill's performances being especially praised. Now, I'm not entirely sure why people hated it so much to begin with. After all, it has every marker of a classic space horror. We've got a spooky ship, a mysterious problem, gore, hallucinations, a vague plot. It's far more than a lot of horrors have to offer. It could be that the film would have fared a little better originally had it not been subject to intense scrutiny in the editing process. The studio, panicked already by problems with Titanic's production, went absolutely mad on the edits, chopping out chunks of the film like there was no tomorrow. Had it retained some of the stuff that Paramount ejected back then who knows? Maybe it would have been a better package overall. 2. Friday the 13th Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan. Now, I don't want anyone to get the wrong idea with this one. Friday the 13th Part 8 is not a good movie, but you should be able to deduce that already from the fact that its title includes the phrase Jason Takes Manhattan, sounding much more Sex and the City than terrifying horror classic. The charm of this late-on installment in the franchise doesn't come from any objective cinematic merit, but instead from its now hilariously goofy kills. It's fair to say that at the time, nobody actually thought the film was going to be taken seriously. So if you go in expecting to see some really stupid, off-the-wall slasher fun, then you won't be disappointed. From a borderline slapstick scene where Jason smashes his hand through a door and accidentally rips off a woman's clothes, like seriously, they weren't even trying to style this one out, to an extended, one-sided boxing scene culminating in a guy getting his head punched clean off his body, the film has it all. Nobody's claiming that this film was a needed addition to the horror genre, but also nobody should be complaining that it came into existence anyway. 1. House. House is that very special breed of weird that the world is never quite ready for, but we're definitely more embracing of it today than we were in the 70s when it was first released. It's a haunted house movie like you've never seen before, and it's just jam-packed with crazy. The house in question is full of objects that come to life with murderous intentions, and there's bizarre imagery with floating heads and corrosive bloodbaths. Whilst to some of us this sounds like a lot of fun to watch as a movie, not to experience ourselves, obviously, 70s audiences thought it was ridiculous. Generally, it seemed that Japanese audiences were far harsher than those in the West, with most reviews praising the film's fever dream-esque nature almost certainly coming out of America. Most audiences didn't like the way the film nodded at its own ridiculousness, how it shamelessly reflected childish fears, turning them into something unique but not classically horrific. Some things just need time for the real fans to make themselves known, and this was one of them. Sure enough, these days, House is pretty acclaimed for doing what it did, and doing it so damn well. And on that note, we've reached the end of this list of 10 hated horror movies that are awesome now. What do you think of these movies? Let us know in the comments below. And remember to check out whatculture.com for more lists and articles like this every day. I've been Amy from What Culture, and I'll catch you next time.